Hi, everyone. Today, I want to share the key lessons in growing a successful design system within a startup, and how anyone can take some of those lessons and apply to their own projects. First, I'll set up a baseline understanding of what I mean with a design system. Then I'll explain what design systems mean to us at Segment. And finally, I will go over some of those key lessons. But first, before we get to the good stuff, let's set some context first. I've been designing mobile and web products for the past 5 years. And currently, I spearhead the design, development, and adoption of our open source design system called Evergreen. So what is Segment? The Segment is a customer data platform, collect data once, then integrate a best-in-class analytics and marketing stack. With the flip of the switch, you can integrate over 200 tools. We're currently about 250 people and growing rapidly. I myself work in the San Francisco office, but we also got Vancouver here represented. And at the end of the year, we have another 29 desks to fill with real career growth opportunities. So now we got that out of the way, what is a design system? A design system is a collection of reusable components that can be assembled in any way to build any number of interfaces or applications. And in a lot of cases within an organization, a design system exists implicitly. You can think of a component library or some of the components or CSS you have, or some of the sketch files or specs you have available. A design system is really about making that explicit. So why do you need a design system? A design system is really to combat design at scale. There's two main points: improving the customer experience through consistency and familiarity, and most importantly, improving the cross-functional efficiency. Because you might have experienced this yourself if you work in a team and you hire someone new, that might not necessarily mean you move faster. More often than not, it increases the complexity of your team. And so having a system in place can really help onboard those people faster. So now I kind of set this baseline of what a design system is. What is Evergreen? Evergreen is our design system at Segment. And we see 3 pillars for Evergreen. We see design, build, and adopt. And the responsibilities for design is maintaining the Sketch UI kit, as well providing process around intaking new components that other parts of the organization might need. On the build part, the responsibilities range from actually building the core UI framework, which I mainly do, and Roland as well as provide developer documentation and a developer experience while onboarding new engineers. And finally, when you have all of that, it's important to actually drive adoption within your organization. Because if you have a design system or a system in place, that doesn't necessarily mean it's being used in your product or application. So the final pillar is adopt. So again, some of those responsibilities under design: UI kit, build, the UI framework. Now, before we go much further in it, I kind of want to highlight atomic design. Brett Frost, which is a front-end developer and a pioneer in this space, has put forward a methodology called atomic design. Now, if you're familiar with React, you're probably familiar with component APIs. And essentially what atomic design means is making some of those different types of components explicit. So let me tell you what that means. When we start with the atoms, within Evergreen, we mean the smallest component that if we break it down further, it doesn't make any sense anymore. If we break down a checkbox, we're left with a color and a shape and an icon in there. You can think of a text input or a button. Those are the atoms. When we go one level up, we have molecules. Molecules, you can think of drop-down menus. You can break them down further and they still make sense, but they're used often as one unit. And then finally, although the distinction between molecules and organisms is less important, you can think about organisms as a table, for example. You might have batch operations represented by checkboxes as well as drop-down menus on each table row. And then finally, there's this concept of templates, which is essentially the final page you see without the application-specific data. And then finally, the actual interface you interface with is called the page or the application or interface, if you will. So now we got an understanding of what Evergreen is and what a design system is. I want to take you back and share some of the lessons on how we got here. Because we didn't start with a whole design system from the get-go. We started with something small and useful. Then after that, we built that out by hijacking a project. I will tell a little bit more what that means later. And then finally, once we had something, we focused on the developer experience to make sure our engineers actually really loved using Evergreen and started adopting it more in their projects. And finally, once we had that, we wanted to show the visibility to the rest of the organization so they knew what we're actually doing and were able to give us more resources to work on Evergreen. So let's start with the first one. About 2 years ago, I started working at Segment. And although I'm a product designer at Segment, I used to work as a front-end developer. And I wanted to create interactive prototypes with a component library. And now, if you start a component library, you run into this problem. How are you going to do styling within React? And there's a couple different ways to do this these days. But the main problems you run into is that defining new components can be annoying. You have to deal with these styles. They can live in CSS modules. They can live in CSS and JS. There's a couple different ways to do that. And then when you have defined a component, it can often be annoying if you need a slightly different configuration of that component. Really what you want is override one of those CSS properties. And finally, there's not really a good way to define spacing between components because the spacing is not really information that belongs to the component. It's much more about the relationship between different components. And then finally, traditional CSS and JS is essentially just moving your class names in a JavaScript file. So the solution we came up with is a React UI primitive. And this is a little bit more common in the industry. We're not the only one doing this, but I think our approach was somewhat unique. So this UI primitive allows us to override properties after we define a component, as well as provide solutions to the spacing issue. And I'll show you a little bit code and what that looks like. So right here, we're defining a button, and we're spreading the props, as you can see on the component. So when I'm using it later on, I can overwrite the padding or the font size, but I can also add any other CSS property, such as display block, for example, or flex. So here's an example of using some of these components. You can see I'm importing that button, and I'm passing margin right. Normally, you would have to create either a class name or wrap it in some spacer component to do this. And then finally, because we're just spreading the props on that component, we can simply pass native properties just as well. And then finally, whereas normally you might have to create a new property up front, you have to think about your component. Oh, I'm designing a button. I want a full width variation. Oh, I want a variation where like the border radiuses are square on one side. You don't have to define all of that up front. You can explicitly define that later. And here, for example, we're defining a full width button. And then finally, often you run into these use cases where really what you want to do is define a layout. You don't necessarily want to create new class names for just displays flex. And sure, there are CSS utility libraries out there, but that's yet another abstraction to learn. Why not use CSS properties right away? So here you can see a header of creating a new item, for example. And everything is co-located. It's essentially the style attribute on steroids, if you will. So why does that work? We created something small and useful. I wanted to prototype outside of our current application, and UIBox really allowed me to prototype really fast. And what we saw is that because our prototype or our library was built on that core React UI primitive, we saw a lot of adoption on Evergreen within our organization because we didn't have to define every configuration up front. So like if you wanted to use a button later on, you could kind of change it slightly. And there was no need for the wrapper components. So the lesson learned here is build something small and useful and drive adoption on that. But I was still working on other projects as well. And so the next lesson is hijack a project. Because often within a smaller startup or a smaller team, you can't always prioritize the design system. So when we're starting to do that, we're probably around 90 people, 80 people at Segment. Now we're about 250. And at this point, we really couldn't prioritize someone working full time on this. So for a large part, it was very much a side hustle for us to support these other teams and support Evergreen. And then second, often you have products within your organization. So it's often kind of hard what product team is responsible for a design system because it's a cross-functional project. everyone is responsible for it. And then last of all, it doesn't always necessarily align with business value. Your product aligns with business value. Just creating a design system is a long-term investment. So the solution here is to pick a project or team that you could see benefits from at least some components or at least parts of the design system. So start defining, spending a little bit of your time doing that while on the team. And then finally, if you're able to find an opportunity to really make it big with your design system, try to pick that opportunity. So at Segment, about a year ago, I started working for Personas. Now, traditionally, the core platform of Segment allows you to take data from your website or mobile app and send it to these integrations, but we're only sending it through this pipeline. The Personas team started to build this user primitive on top of this pipeline. And once you have that user primitive, you can start building a segmentation or audience engine around that. So before, we were much more just like the developer had to log into the system and debug the system. We didn't have a lot of UI. And now we're entering this marketing automation space, which required a lot more UI for marketers to come in and define that. And so I joined that team, and we're kind of building, and I'm creating components a little bit. And then our company announced that about 3 months in advance, we're going to do our first ever exclusive user conference for about 250 CTOs, engineering managers, and CEOs. And we were going to announce this product, Personas. And although we had experimented and we had like some good infrastructure around the user profiles, we were still far away from releasing a consumer-grade product. And so we had 3 months to go, and it seemed like kind of a crazy deadline to go there. But I saw it as an opportunity to really start building more out of the design system. Because what I recommended to do is that we create a standalone React application without any backend, with fake data, that would show the vision of Personas a year from now. Not what we could build within those 3 months, but a year from that. Essentially, concept car, if you will. And this allowed me to build out all these components within the design system and empower that in the prototype. Those 3 months were some of the craziest months I've worked at Segment and in my career, and it really brought our team closer together. And then finally the day came. We had practiced the script over and over again. Our head of product and our CEO were on stage. I was upstairs in the tech booth. I was actually just sharing my screen like I'm doing right now. And I was clicking on the exact button on the right moment as the head of product was saying something and explaining something. Most people after thought that was actually a video we recorded, but it was just me clicking around. It was a huge success. And so after this, what we ended up with, I hijacked this project, I built out a design system and a prototype. So now we're left with this first iteration of a design system, which we could now build out even more. So the lesson learned here is hijack a project. And it might not come along right away as you wanted. Your company might not be ready from the start, but start learning about design systems, and maybe when the opportunity comes, you can take that opportunity. So now we're gonna go a little bit more technical. So we had this system. It was right after Personas. Now we still had to build out all of the, get customer feedback, actually build this product. But for Evergreen, what it meant that we had more and more people using it in our application, more and more engineers. And what we ran into is that it was actually kind of hard to use. Because what we did, I was inspired by AtlasKit. AtlasKit is a very mature design system by Atlassian, which you might know for Confluence or Jira. And they were much bigger than we were. They had 40 people, or have now 40 people working full-time just on their design system. And what they did, they had a mono repo. You might be familiar with React as a mono repo, Babel, all these. But they had a mono repo, and they had a package for each and every component. And I thought it was great because it seemed really clean to do that. So I opted in that from the start, but little did I know it was much more a problem for a bigger scale company than what we were experiencing. We should really have focus on just churning out new components and writing documentation. So what it meant that upgrading dependencies was a mess in our application because you needed to know like, oh, I need to import alert from Evergreen alert and buttons from this packages, and some packages were slightly different. So the consumers of Evergreen were not all that happy. And then creating the system was a pain as well because we were using Storybook at the time, which is like a playground for React components. And each Storybook lived in each component package. So if you needed another component, well, it was just like one big mess. And when you're building something like this, it can often feel overwhelming because you made this poor choice at the start, and now you think, how can I get over that? This is gonna take ages to fix. Because we had around 200 places in our app where we're using Evergreen at that point. And it's pretty hard to convince any engineer to go in and just like rewrite all those imports. And most of all, it's very error prone. So what we decided to do is automate this process. We had, with a single click, we migrated over 200 files in our code base from the above example to the below example. And how we did that, we learned about an AST to run on our JavaScript files. And we scanned for the import lines and then rewrote those to the example below. Now, for the consumers, this was really great because they just had to think about upgrading Evergreen UI and just importing the components and everything would be available. But also on the system side, it was great because now I could just write my documentation without having to worry too much. So in the end, happy developers. So the lesson learned here is this was one of the many ways we improved the developer experience. And in that way, we really drove adoption more and more within our organization. But that's not the end because our engineers were using it, but most of the people in our organization were not aware of the technology. We're not aware what design systems are. So we want to evangelize that. And we wanted to provide visibility. And one way, which I think is quite unique, I want to share with you. So one of the problems is that if there's a lack of visibility in your system, it's sometimes hard to have to prioritize fixing that system, essentially, and trying to figure out which new components do I make or what documentation to write. And at this point, we actually didn't have just Evergreen in our app. We actually had 3 different UI libraries in our app. We had React UI library, which is actually the precursor of Evergreen, and then we had some legacy UI stuff. And it's really hard to know, like, hey, is this component used anywhere in our app? There might be an icon from the legacy UI folder that's only used at one place, but no one dares to like switch that out and then like delete the code. So we had to have some way to learn how to deprecate those components. And then above all, we wanted to have more resources allocated to work in Evergreen. So we wanted to give insight into the process. And so what we ended up with to create an adoption dashboard. I'll explain a little bit more how this works later, but essentially what we wanted to do, we wanted to show global adoption. At any single point in time, I want to know how much Evergreen is in our app compared to the old libraries. As well as I want to show a chart where Evergreen goes up, the other things goes down. So you can see here, for example, the global adoption, and then on the right, you can see the week-over-week adoption. And now on the bottom, we have a tree map. And so what we did when we run, actually I'll show here how we actually did that. And so what we did, we wrote a tool because now we had figured out this technology to run this AST and to understand all the imports in our JavaScript files. So why not use that for analytics as well? And above all, we're an analytics company. So we wrote this small tool that actually allowed us to extract all of this information from our file system, from our application. And actually it works for any dependency in our app. And it shows us all the files where each component is used. So we can know exactly, hey, this button is used in like 200 files or in that file and that file. Then we have that report and we save that. And we save that every time our continuous integration job runs. Say like, hey, run this little command, and then we save that report. And then later on, it builds our dashboard, and that simply takes in all of the JSON. This tool, dependency report, is available also open source. And so what you end up with in the dashboard is for each of those components, I know where they are used. So I can actually track them down. I can filter like, hey, I want to see all the components that are only used once. That's legacy UI, giving me a hit list of things to kill. So the lesson learned here is once you drive adoption, when you have something that works, it might be a design system, might be your own product, and within an organization, not always everyone is aware of that if it's an engineering or technology that you're building. So provide visibility to the rest of your organization and evangelize that. So today I talked a little bit about some of the key lessons I learned in building a successful design system, Evergreen. And I talked a little bit what is a design system to set a baseline as well, explain what Evergreen is. And then finally kind of explain that start with something small. Most design systems out there or big products are often started with something that works really well and then building on top of that. So don't feel overwhelmed. And finally, in the end, remember, building a design system is not about reaching a single point in time. It's an ongoing process of learning, building, evangelizing, and driving adoption in your organization. And on that note, thank you.
Any questions?
Hi, so you say that like when you do the design system and then you make something small first and then build something like build a big project on top of it. So have you ever experienced something like you need to change something that small thing and the whole thing break? Have you ever experienced it, and then how did you fix it?
Sure. So the question is, if I change, since I have this small thing where a lot of components depend on, if I change some tiny thing in like this core atom, does the rest of the system break? And I mean, like, it could, right? Like, if you change that often. But I think, like, especially with those kind of things, with those kind of dependency trees, you really want to follow semantic versioning, for example, that you know, like, hey, only if I release a major version of that piece of software, I expect a breakage in the API. So I think, like, yeah, just by convention, following semantic versioning, we're able to sort of like not run into those issues that much. All right, next question.
Here.
Oh, hey.
Do you have to support like schemes, color schemes in this project? And also, how do you validate like pixel perfect? Because these sketch UIs are beautiful, and then when you port to React, they are not pretty.
Ooh. So the question is, how do you support
because
skins?
sorry, because you said that you used to work with Storybook. I didn't understand if you keep using it or if you.
Sure. Okay. So the question is there skinning? How do you make sure there's like pixel perfection? And then the last thing was, do you use Storybook, and what kind of other tools do you use? Yes, actually, we're releasing like a big major version right now, Evergreen V4, which is much more also focused on the community and is going to have theming support, and there's a lot of improvements on the site. So yes, we will have theming, and actually we'll have it in a way where you can actually pick your own CSS implementation and really change the appearance of the buttons and of the styles of the input fields. Whereas most design systems just allow you to pass a couple of colors and kind of change it. This system actually allows you to fully customize it. And so the second question was, how do you maintain pixel perfection? I like to start, actually a lot of components were born in code, not actually in Sketch. So there's often like an afterthought for me where I go back in Sketch, provide the right tools for the designers. I would say in most cases, the React UI framework is the source of truth. That's what's used in the application. So you want to focus more on that. If there's like some slight inconsistencies within the sketch, it's less important because like that component is not going to end up, in our case, it's not going to end up in the UI. And so, yes, we started off with Storybook. It's a great tool to get started, but what we run into is that like, you really want to design your developer documentation, and you really want to like give your developers like a good experience. So we started to run our own documentation where, yeah, we essentially like build our own tools based on some of the examples out there, essentially. All right, next question.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk, by the way. It was really good and really well researched.
Thank you.
So I really like your idea of giving control for padding and margins outside of the components or passing the props down. What about styling though? Isn't it a little bit dangerous to let people modify, color? What if they think that purple looks really great with a red text?
Yeah, so the question is like, how do you, if you can't pass any CSS property, are you not gonna end up with like a Frankenstein monster in the end? In our case, actually, yes, that is definitely a concern we're running it more into. So, I mean, not people are actually doing that. But like on the long term, like we started really implicit with a really implicit system, kind of everything goes. And that's still sort of like the core foundation of Evergreen. But now as we're learning more and more about the requirements and how actually people are using it, we're starting to lock down a system more and making it explicit. And even long term, looking at something like TypeScript to really lock things down. In the case of spacing and stuff, we don't really have any examples where it went wrong because like, you know, we know people, but it's definitely a danger. What we're working on with UIBox is that you can actually take some of the APIs. So you can say like, hey, I just want to use dimensions. I just want to use spacing. I just want to use position. So you don't actually have dangerous properties. So like the safe properties is everything that kind of goes around the component and kind of like position that's on the page, layout. And then we consider the appearance, actually everything that goes into components, such as the background color, box shadows, and these kind of things. So that's kind of how we combat that.
I have a question about mostly the process of the way you introduce new components into a system. So basically, you mentioned Sketch. Can you describe a little bit the process of, I would assume you guys have a design team, right? That probably designs the mockups and probably introduces new components into it. And after that, passes it down to you guys. And I would assume you do a development in Storybook, and after that, standardize and push it to production. Can you just maybe talk a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So the question is like, how's our process from like design to development and what ends up in the product? I think it's definitely like different for different people on our team. I historically did a lot in code, so I'm officially on the design team, but I do a lot of engineering with this kind of project. Yeah, I think like the more our team starts to grow, the more designers we get, they often have more traditional skill set. So they would work in Sketch, so we have to write tools for them. And then essentially when it goes downstream to development, we make sure to have the they only really have the components available that are in Evergreen. And then when they have a new component, we're setting up process around, hey, how do we provide process around that for those product teams to make sure that like, hey, does this needs to be in Evergreen, yes or no? And then we kind of help them. So it's kind of like an internal service within our company where we kind of provide that. It's definitely obviously a tricky thing. But I also believe that you don't want to block your product teams from actually shipping something. Sometimes it can be easier to just kind of have it go, kind of have people define some of those things, and then later on go in and kind of really systemize it more. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to hear mostly about is there is some tools that you use, like for example, InVision or Zipline, or
sure.
Right? Like it's mostly, do they provide you just like a page of different states for the component and you pick it and put it into code, or do you have an agile process of you sitting with designer and talking about the same thing?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, like, every designer kind of has his own tool set. I would say, like, some are more and less technical. But yeah, like we use Zeppelin. I think it's less like in sort of an ideal state. Really, what you want to achieve is that a designer should be able to like make a napkin sketch, really low fidelity. And then because you have such a strong system in place, the engineer is saying like, oh yeah, there's a select menu, does this and this and this. So really you want to bring sort of the fidelity down of the design stage. So preferably, while they have all the high fidelity tools, so they put out high fidelity work, but it's not that they're designing every time that they're designing a component over and over again. So I would say like tools such as Zeppelin are not as important because it's mainly for speccing out things, but it can still be useful for layout if you want to know like, hey, what's the width of this thing and these kind of things. Yeah, and we use Marvel for the prototyping.
Last question.
Cool. So thanks for the wonderful talk. Just wanted to ask that method of hijacking a project, that's a really cool way of hacking into the process of the big company and getting your design system up and running. My question is, how do you get a broader and longer term buy-in from management to pour resources into the design system? Because it's not a trivial undertaking. How do you kind of sell this thing to decision makers?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, since I joined Segment, I was trying to push for design systems, at least trying to push for component libraries. But you know, this is like a little bit less than 2 years ago, and you know, the first batch was building out the React UI library. And so like it can definitely be a big challenge to do that. You don't know if your company is ready. I actually wrote a blog post for designsystems.com on exactly hijacking a project. So actually it's in there as well. So if you want to read that. But I think like, yeah, it's obviously a challenge. I think like the big thing is that it often takes a while if you have a system for people to actually start adopting it. So like if you yourself are really eager about the system, those other people, it's just like, oh, it's that tool like Jay is making, like, yeah, I might have to take a look at it, but they might not necessarily use it. But then we have something that kind of works, like they're probably realistically only going to use it in their next project, right? They're not yet going to use it, especially an engineering tool. They might like, you know, I was a designer building an engineering tool. They might have some questions about that as well. So yeah, it's definitely a long process. And I think like what really helped on the engineering side is to find that documentation, because often that is the extra thing that the other components don't have. And so make it easier to use your system than what's out there. Like it's very easy for me to give a UI kit with all beautiful components. It's actually like, yes, like this is gonna be amazing. You did my job for me essentially. Like I can just like plug and play and like, you know, everything is there. So make the lives of other people easier, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.